to the EB Insights podcast. This podcast is going to be a little bit different because we have not one, but two very special guests on today's podcast and a really exciting launch to talk about as well. So, the first guest we have today is Amit Parmar, who is the CEO and co founder of Cliquify. I'm really excited to have him actually for the first time on the podcast, Amit.
Love this. I'm grateful to be joined by the very special Jake. I'm excited for the dialogue today, and thank you, Sandra, for recording your first podcast with me.
And so you've introduced our second guest, which is Jake Canull. He is the regional director of the Americas at the Top Employers Institute. They have a globally recognized certification program that helps organizations improve their talent strategies. And so Amit and Jake are here today because Cliquify and the Top Employers Institute has released the recent, most updated 2025 Employer Branding Priorities and Budgets report. So excited to kind of dive into that today. So again, welcome Amit and Jake. So let's first, because Amit, this is your first time on the podcast, I'd love for you just to kind of quickly, obviously introduce yourself, but also talk about what led you to start Cliquify.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. So just real quickly, been in the talent space for close to 20 plus years in large multinational companies. Built Cliquify with really a simple mission to allow enterprises around the world to really understand what happens at the local offices and the local cultures, and get those stories in front of the right kind of audience as it relates to talent, external as well as internal. And how you do it at scale to attract and retain the best talent that's out there. And so launched Cliquify about 5 years ago now. Time just flies.
Great. And Jake, I've obviously heard of Top Employers Institute and have read so much of your research and your studies. So give us a little bit of background on yourself, and also can you tell our audience a little bit more about the business and what it is that you provide other companies and organizations?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for having me both. My name is Jake Canull. I am the regional director of the Americas for Top Employers Institute. So I have a team that looks over North America, Latin America. We have a team in Brazil and Mexico City and in New York, and team members spread out across. But I've been with the firm for a little over 6 months now, been in the broader HR and HR tech space for the last decade. I'd say the through line in my career has really been around how do you empower HR and talent leaders with new insights to help them make better decisions. Okay, so that played itself out in several different capacities in my past life in HR tech. And I brought kind of the same themes to Top Employers Institute and thinking about how do we help HR and talent leaders and execs access this database of information that doesn't really exist anywhere else, and through doing that, also connect it to their employee value proposition, their employer brand, to see and market where are they above industry and regional benchmarks, can they communicate that? Where are they below benchmarks when it comes to people practices? And then how can they over time really do two things: correlate people practices to business outcomes that matter for their teams, and then secondarily tie what they're doing really well to their employee value prop, and then invest where they're not as strong, right? So all about people practices, all about really connecting the people practices to the employer brand and doing it in a way that is legit. Like, hey, this is backed up. The audit team's been through. You say this is true, but is it actually true of your employer brand and of what you do as a company? And so we validate that on a global scale with more than 2,300 global multinational companies. So that's a bit about me and why I came to Top Employers.
That's great. And so there's an obvious crossover, and it might answer the question of why did you decide to partner this year with Cliquify on this survey? So it's the third annual survey, but the first time that we've partnered with you.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, Amit and I got connected through, I think, a mutual connection. A few different talent leaders actually said, "Hey, you got to talk to this guy. He knows the space, knows what he's doing." And I saw the employer branding component of using technology to really, I think, from what I can take from it, consolidate several different resources into one place and then drive a lot of value for the employer branding teams, right? So one of the things we run into over at Top Employers is a lot of employers want to share their story of actually being a certified top employer, but many don't really know where to start, right? So it's access to the insights to help guide that. Amit and I got connected through mutual connections in the talent and HR space, and kind of seemed like a no-brainer. He showed me this study they do every year over at Cliquify, and I was looking through it, and I kind of thought, okay, this is an interesting data set that doesn't seem to exist for the employer branding contingency, at least anywhere else. So we threw in a couple of useful insights that we collected in aggregate, and it just seemed like it made sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and you've included a lot of statistics as well, which when we kind of jump into the survey, we'll talk a little bit more about the benefit that an organization who invests in or measures their employer branding function finds within the business. And you know, it's definitely much more than just a feel good sentiment. There's real business value in investing in employer branding. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. One of the practices we measure, and you can think of people practices in many ways, but just to be super specific, an example of a people practice we measure in develop might be we personalize the learning experience of our managers. And HR and talent teams who respond to our survey will either say, we consistently do it, we sometimes do it, we never do it, right? And then our audit team will validate, does that exist? Is that true? One of the practices we measure on the attract pillar we have is around consistently and systematically measuring your employer brand year over year. Okay, so the organizations that consistently do that, there's a slew of outcomes you can expect. Those that consistently do it, 23% more likely to have high employee engagement, 10% more likely to have high revenue growth, 14% more likely to have high market share growth, right? And then 13% more likely to have high internal promotion rates, and 9% more likely to be highly profitable. And so I think what this is saying, it's correlations, right? Not causal, but at a correlated level, what you can say for sure is the organizations that consistently year over year systematically measure their employer brand and then improve it where they're ahead or communicate where they're ahead and then improve where they're behind, they're going to be the ones that outperform their peers in the next 5, 10, 20, 30 years. So we talked a lot about this actually at an event that we did in New York called HR Beyond 2030, which Ahmed actually came to as well, which was great to see him there. So, yeah.
And I will add to that. You know, when I saw some of those stats, as a former talent leader, it was all about the numbers, right? Like the touchy-feely things that you get in employer branding or just marketing in general, right? Is real out there with the C-suite. So some of the stats, Jake, that you shared around profitability, market share growth, all of that super powerful when you put it in front of C-level executives.
I wish I could take credit, but it's all a research team. So we got a team of PhDs, you know, the doctors I call them on this side, and they help make me look smart. So appreciate them. Shout out Emily.
And the data set, Jake, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's 2,300 plus organizations, right? I mean, that's a pretty vast data set.
Yeah, 2,300 plus. Many of those are global multinationals, so they have presence in, you know, the U.S., in Europe, in Africa, in Asia Pacific, in Latin America. So they're truly global. And forgive me if I missed Middle East as well. Forgive me if I missed anything else. But yeah, it's really a global data set. About half of those are over 1,000 employees globally. About half are under 1,000 employees. So, you know, it's a good mix. And many of them we certify kind of by country, so that data set exists at a very granular level as well.
That's great. In the show notes below, we'll link you to the survey that we're going to talk about now, the Global Employer Branding Survey. We'll also link you to Top Employers Institute so that you can go there, and also to Jake's profile as well. So all of those resources will be included. But let's jump into the survey. So Amit, this is the third year that Cliquify has conducted this survey. Can you give the audience just a bit of background on who completes it and the types of questions and information and data that's asked of them?
Yeah. So Sandra, you know, why did we create this survey in particular? Because there's tons of surveys out there in HR and talent and employer branding in particular. Well, we found a gap in what kind of data was being presented to talent leaders and employer branding leaders globally. And the gap was, of course, there's a lot of data available for, like, you know, this is what the EVP looks like for the particular demographic. Maybe it's early career and so on, right? So there are a lot of outfits out there, or my peers in the industry who provide that kind of data. but really nobody provides operational data for what the function is doing itself, right? How is the budget shaping up for that function? How are you organized? What kind of tools are you using, right? To really help the employer branding practitioner or professional really start to understand and almost like start to benchmark how their function is compared to their peers in the industry. And when we kind of, and as a former leader, this is something I would want to see out of my employer branding leader as I'm thinking about budget decisions. And frankly, none of that existed out there at the granular level that we provided. So that was kind of the genesis of the report. I will say over the last 3 years, we've had over 7,000 downloads of the report. So it certainly is valuable. I still get emails about how valuable that report is. So it is our marquee report. So we're excited to partner with the Top Employers Institute this year to actually add on to the data set. And we'll continue to build upon the data sets every year. So each year, we kind of make the report even more rich. So super excited to continue for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I would say actually this is how I even heard of Cliquify for the first time. So in my independent contracting role, I was working with a client and helping them build a business case for investment and more of a structure around the employer brand function, which was kind of buried between a bunch of different functions at the time. And so as I was pulling research, this was one of the pieces of research, which was the study 2 years ago. So it was for 2023 priorities. And so there's a lot of, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of data in here, and you can kind of see how that data evolves. But I think for either talent acquisition who's trying to create a function, or the HR function who's trying to really create a narrative around why there needs to be an investment, it's extremely useful. But it's also really useful for employer brand practitioners who right now might be building their budgets or strategies for 2025 to get some kind of a benchmark, because I think there is a lot of data out there that from an employer brand perspective you might pull to make that business case, but it also kind of sits within other functions. This is very EVP, employer brand, talent attraction focused in terms of building your strategy. And one of the things that I noticed in this year's report as well, it talks a lot about the alignment between employer brand as a function or as a priority and talent strategy, and not just talent acquisition, but workforce planning, talent management, et cetera. So Amit, I'll start with you just in terms of what the key findings are. And then Jake, I'd love for you to jump in, because obviously this is what your bread and butter and what you guys do in terms of sort of helping the people processes and talent HR processes within a business in terms of best practices. So can you give a little highlight, Amit, on those findings this year?
Yeah. So one of the questions we ask the participants, which by the way, this year we had 44 enterprises around the world participate in the survey. So, and on the talent strategy bit, this is the first year, right? Because we've been doing this for 3 years. Of course, I personally read those submissions as and when I can. And this is the first year. I'm very pleased to see employer branding leaders and professionals indicate how well they are aligned, or how they plan to better align with talent acquisition, with workforce planning functions, and talent management functions, right? Which is music to my ears as you think about how valuable the employer branding function is when they actually are thinking about the employee experience and then the candidate experience, kind of inside out, right? Of course, they're both important, but it's the inside out branding, and it's great to see that one of the things or initiatives that employer branding leaders are prioritizing is the tighter integration of functions. And in the report, we actually delve deep into what that actually looks like. How are they actually partnering with these cross-functional HR and talent leaders?
So Jake, in terms of what Top Employers Institute sees from the companies that you work with, what do you see as some of the benefits, or even maybe the changes in how, either if it's just employer brand or if it's talent acquisition in general, how are they aligning with other talent management, talent workforce planning parts of the organization? Do you see a trend there? Is it all over the map, and do you see pros and cons on that front?
Yeah, great question. And I might tie in some of what Amit had shared earlier. So I'll talk about it at a high level first, then I'll get a little bit granular. Um, in the Top Employers Institute certification program and kind of what we do, right, there are 6 pillars in which we measure people practices. So we look across steer, which is more business strategy at the HR strategy level, shape, which is thinking about digital HR and the future of HR, attract, which touches on employer brand and onboarding, develop, right? Then engage for employee engagement, and then unite, which is more on sustainability, DEI, some of those core functions. So across those 6 pillars, 2 things we're kind of noticing in general. Number one, every single one of those pillars matters for your employer brand. Number two, that data is really hard to access unless you're using systems that pull it together. Okay, so for us at Top Employers Institute, we have a lot of data. For example, Amit mentioned like thinking about your EVP from the inside out. You think about something like internal promotion rates, right? High internal promotion rates. You might not directly correlate your employer brand to higher internal promotion rates. But at Top Employers Institute, one of the practices we saw, and you'll see this in the report as well, so here's a little teaser, is that organizations who align their EVP with the talent acquisition and talent strategy, they're 7% more likely to have high internal promotion rates. And so what is this telling us? It's telling us, I think, mainly 2 things, not to be too redundant, but one is the more we align the value for our employees to not only external facing candidates, but internal facing employees, the greater value we can create as a business. And then the second thing is the deeper we understand what our unique employee value proposition is through data insights and benchmarking, which we offer in our certification program, the better you can position yourself in the market as compared to your peers in the industry, in the region, but also globally. I was talking to a pharmaceutical company in Canada this morning, an HR leader there, and they're bringing in pharmacists from other countries, moving them to the local job market to really hire more pharmacists because they're having trouble finding them in Canada. So how do you think about talent attraction in that market? How do you think about branding if you're a Canadian employer focused on Canadian people, but then you're going to India, Europe, Africa, wherever you're going to get talent? It's just a different way of thinking when you're a global company.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting too. So as we get to kind of what some of the core priorities are that the survey respondents were focused on this year, one of them obviously being employee value proposition, employer value proposition. There's always that question of, does it have to be consistent? Yes, but it also has to be specific to the talent type and to the talent persona, right? So that example that you just mentioned, you do need to have a consistent proposition in the sense that you need to know what that company stands for, the values, the type of thing that the experiences they want to create for employees, which should be consistent. But you also need to speak to the interests and the concerns and the priorities. If you think of the law, the hierarchy of, I always forget Maslow's hierarchy. You got to speak the fundamental levels before they'll even engage in a conversation with you about a potential opportunity at that company. So yes, it needs to be consistent in that it shouldn't feel like 2 different companies, but it also needs to be translated very specifically. So if you think about, Amit, I'll pass this to you, the topic of content. And,
Yeah.
a lot of survey respondents talking about how they want to focus that content. So how are they going to translate that EVP to those talent types? What did you learn from this year's survey?
Yeah. So a couple of practices that bubbled up in the survey responses, which is of course taking the corporate level unique EVP, and then to your point, Sandra and Jake, basically getting it to a persona level, be it a business unit and or function or department, or even at the role level in a particular geography, right? So really cutting it and segmenting it that way. And then starting to listen, right? So there's a whole listening element to what it is that attracted those folks to join the organization and what it is that keeps them at that organization, right? So there's a whole listening element that came out in the survey as one of the activities or initiatives. And then once you listen to those, and it could take various sizes and shapes, right? It could be focus groups, or it could literally be your HR business partners who are really hopefully ingrained in the local markets. So there are various ways to get to that listening component. And when you start to listen to just those two questions, right? Why you joined and why you stay, right? You start to really get at, and of course, combine that with data sets from like the TEI, Jake, and so on. I think you can really start to craft your content strategy based on that, right? And the content strategy might take a shape of different formats, right? So be it employee stories, videos, or photos. Maybe you're celebrating, your employee's anniversary at a local level. There's a very different way that it happens in Brazil than in Budapest. And so, how do you actually get those stories and bubble them to the top? And then, how do you distribute them in a branded way, right? And that's uh, the scalability of the distribution also takes shape in the priorities, right? So we do talk a little bit about in the report how our employer branding professionals thinking about distributing the content in different places like LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, where the talent actually hangs out these days, right? Like I have a 13-year-old. I can guarantee you the way he's going to find his next job is probably going to be TikTok, right? So how we actually talk about a little bit about that in the report as well is really thinking about your content strategy and the distribution strategy to get your story, your real stories, in front of the right people at the right time and hopefully at the right cost.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's very important because it's, again, going back to the point of one piece of content isn't going to work for every talent type, every persona. But also, Jake, going back to your point about internal promotion, I don't want to lose the fact that the reason why those numbers will go up is because your EVP or the story that you're telling is consistent internally and externally, right? So you're not doing a sleight of hand card trick when you're trying to attract talent that when they walk in the door, they're like, oh, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, right? So that authenticity piece as well, which really speaks to really the topic of employee engagement and how engaged are the employees while they're sitting at their desk working, how engaged they are with the company and with the company values, and how engaged are they enough to be advocates for your company as an employer of choice externally. What are some of the things that you've seen around employee engagement? I know we have some things that came out in the study as well. So what are some of the thoughts you have around that?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, good question. I don't want to spoil too much. I'll hint at one more kind of did you know kind of stat we did throw in a minute. But when people think about employee engagement as it relates to employer brand, I want to talk about this one for a second because this is interesting. I've spent a lot of my career almost I would say obsessed with collecting employee sentiment and collecting the employee voice and trying to figure out exactly how employees feel. And the pursuit, while really important and every company needs to do it, can be a challenge, right? Because so much of your employee engagement, so much of that employee's individual experience, especially if you're an HR exec or a talent leader or employer branding leader, is out of your control because the reality is it lies in the hands of their manager who might have not treated them the best that day. Let's be real, right? So I think if you think about that context, you look at employee sentiment as really, or employee engagement in some cases, almost as a lagging indicator of, hey, this is the outcome that happens based on the practices, how we're positioning ourselves, et cetera, in the market that happens. So what we focus on a lot at Top Employers Institute, and kind of the stat I'll get to here, is what are the leading indicators? What are the practices that if you set them up correctly and organize information around them to collect data from your HR and people team and employer branding team, that you can then make better choices to deliver better outcomes for employees, right? It's almost like, in some ways, it almost has nothing to do with each other, but you want that authentic brand to really communicate down to that lagging indicator that is the employee engagement side. So a quick stat from that, orgs who consistently communicate their EVP company-wide and keep it consistent, 15% more likely to have high employee engagement. Okay, so that's, hey, we've communicated our employee value prop. We're not only communicating it to managers, but every single employee internally. And so do you feel like it's true? In the cases where it is, employee engagement is going to go way higher. In the cases where it's not, you'll have a challenge, right? So I think that transparency and accountability component, especially what we're seeing of all generations in the workforce nowadays with access to tech, I mean, it's really important. And I loved Amit's point on the channel before, because you can keep the consistent messaging of your employee value prop and your employer brand, but the channel might change the way you present that consistent message, right?
Yeah, and as well as it's not just communicating your EVP, it's demonstrating the authenticity behind it by doing things like your performance management, your talent development. All of that should be aligned with the story that you say you, as an employer, the value you're providing to your employees for their careers. So it's ensuring that that's embedded, which kind of also goes back to that first point about employer brand shouldn't be something that sits, or whoever manages that should not sit in one part of the business isolated, especially when it comes to HR and talent management or talent development functions, because that is something that should be consistent throughout the organization and embedded into policies and practices.
Yeah, and if I may add to that, to kind of thank you for that, Sandra. So for Jake, when you said it's just the frontline manager, right? We all know that's the number one reason for resignations. Probably still holds true. I haven't seen the latest stats. One of the things that was really interesting to me, and that's also included in this report, is when leadership behaviors and competencies are included as part of the EVP. And what it does to your market share and growth. So I don't want to steal your thunder there, Jake. So if you could actually talk a little bit about that. And that was actually very, I got to be honest, it's the first time I've even seen a stat like that. Very powerful, right, as it relates to leadership behaviors and how, if it's included in the EVP, what it does to your market share, your profitability, and your revenue.
Yeah, well, I'm glad we pulled these in because I think if you're setting an employer brand, you're looking at your team, you're looking across the board, and you're thinking, well, you'll learn in this report if on average budgets are going up, down, or staying the same. So download the report, check it out. But if you're thinking, how can I be more useful in my role and provide a lot more value for the business consistently over the next decade? Well, think about this. One of the stats we found as we were looking through some of the data was that organizations, as Amit was saying, who consistently include leadership behaviors and competencies in their EVP, they're 6% more likely to have high revenue growth, 9% more likely to have high market share growth, 7% more likely to have high profit growth, right? So you're looking across the board and you're wondering, okay, what does our board care about? What does our CEO, what does our CFO care about? I'm in employer branding or I'm in HR or talent. They care about revenue growth, profitable growth, market share growth, and they care about doing it in a way that actually supports employees and leadership development. So that was another big stat. We found that a lot of heads of HR even are looking at next year and they're saying, what are our top priorities? One is, how are we going to embed AI into the things we do in our people practices? Two is, how do we continue to develop our leaders at a topic level? So yeah, a lot of interesting pieces in there.
It's all aligned. It's all connected, just like the Matrix. So the last point I kind of want to hit on, we talked a bit about resources and budgets. And again, there's more insights in the report. I think one thing that I've been talking about quite a bit on podcasts, we've done some blogs on it, you hear about it a lot. It relates more to operational efficiencies. So more specifically, the technology that employer brand talent acquisition teams are using in order to pull all of this together. So you've seen that there is a high level of fragmentation in the market, and it obviously evolves. It's clearly a budget concern, but it's also a resource concern from a timing perspective, because the more places you have to go, the less time you have for other things. So I guess I just want to ask Amit, what are some of the key takeaways that you learned from this survey related to the HR technology that these individuals are prioritizing or are wanting to prioritize in 2025?
Yeah, so it's this one, being in employer branding tech is an area that we pay close attention to. What's interesting is that over the years that I have been in the HR function as a leader, your budgets rarely increase, right? So you always have to find the money basically every year, right? So how can you be faster, better, cheaper, right? unless of course you're like in hyper growth mode. Of course, hopefully your budget will keep increasing, but generally speaking, it's very hard to find new money within the budget, right? So you're constantly going to have that battle as HR. I know there's always the talk about as HR a cost center. Well, it is in the financial books, right? And if as long as we're a cost center in the financial books, as SEC will look at us, you're constantly going to be thinking about how can I do things faster, better, cheaper. And to be honest, there's only like really two ways you can do things trying to find the money. You can implement tech, right? Improve your process. Actually, there's three ways. Sorry, I lied. You can improve your processes, right? So you just do things more efficiently. Invest in tech to be able to enable that. And lastly, unfortunately, sometimes it's reducing program or headcount dollars, right? To be able to fund the things that you want to be able to fund. So the way what we found in the research finding or in the research study is really there's consolidation happening with the dollars, and reallocation happening with the dollars because there's no new money. So if you had I'm just making this up, but if you had $100,000 on average every year, where would you spend that? Where we're seeing the money being spent right now for next year, and you'll find more details about this in the report, is doing things faster. Jake mentioned AI, so certainly, how are you investing in AI to drive more productivity? How are you actually balancing that? Employer branding is in a very unique position right now because you've got AI, which is like not human whatsoever, right? But you're trying to tell human-based stories, right? So it's a very interesting intersection that you have with technology and being human from an employer branding standpoint. Lastly, what we're seeing is this shift towards headcount reduction, actually not reduction, but just headcount being flat rather, right? So there are countless teams that we're finding employer branding. There's like one or two people at most in very large organizations, right? So they're going to be constantly being pushed to really think hard about their tech stack. Are you using too many tools, which is also in the report? We're seeing on average companies use about 5 different tools to do their jobs, which to me in this day and age sounds very inefficient. So there are opportunities there. You'll see in the report as well. And there's work to be done. There's work to be done in all of a sudden you're not gonna be allocated 5 to 10 new headcount. You're gonna continue to be pushed to do more with less. And how do you do that with enabling technology, and how you actually define your technology strategy is going to be key.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just having, speaking as someone who was in that position for many years of flat budgets, but yet the expectations kept growing. Once you did something there, well, let's do that more, but we don't have anything else to put to it. So you always have to look at what you have and rethink it, right? So it's just prioritizing what your strategy is going to be. You can't do everything. You can't answer every request that comes to you from a talent leader or an HR leader. You need to really set, and this is the time of year that everyone is setting their budgets, they're setting their strategies, they're trying to align their budgets to their strategies. So to that point, looking at operational efficiencies that match your priority. So once you decide what it is that you want to prioritize, then take a step back. And even though, you might be very comfortable with all of the different things that you have on your screen and all the different logins that you go into, how much time is that taking? How much money does that cost? Who else do you need to go in and learn that system? Are you asking recruiters to go in there? Are you asking hiring managers to go in there? Because the second there's a stop sign at any path along the way, they will stop because they have day jobs. So I think that's a really important kind of piece to focus on as people are putting together their budgets and their strategies as well.
Yeah, and there's an interesting angle to this, Sandra, right? To your point with the employee experience with tools that they're being asked to access and work with. So I don't know, Jake, if there's anything, and sorry to put you on the spot, I don't know if there's anything in your in your research that actually gets at how many tools are we throwing at recruiters, at hiring managers, at employees even, right? And whether that kind of constitutes the employee experience practice, if you will.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know we have data on the HR tech and like HR tech strategy as far as how employers are using HR tech in the context of the people practices. I don't know if I could comment on that point directly, so I'll have to go back and look at the data with the team, but maybe worth a future discussion on that one for sure. But you did talk about something that I think um, is interesting too. If you think about the future of employer branding, talent, and HR. Or you talked about HR being a cost center. I hear this all the time, right? We talk about this all the time, and I think we both know that in order for chief people officers, heads of employer branding, heads of human resources, heads of talent, to really reshape their perception in the executive team, continue to we talked about HR Beyond 2030 a couple weeks ago. It really has to be grounded in data-driven decision making. So no matter what your tech stack, no matter what your practices are today, what data are you accessing to improve decision making moving forward? And then, Amit, like you said, rather than even maybe using AI to create, you don't have to use AI to create, a human story. You might want to, right? But you also might want to just use AI to analyze all the data for you to make recommendations that you can then operate based on with context, right? So there's different ways to think about it, and a lot of it's not generative per se.
Yeah, you touch on an interesting topic, which is insights and data. And this happens today, right? Like there's millions, and there's another project I'm involved in right now where we're looking at how much companies are spending just on content, right? Be it marketing departments or even employer branding or HR departments. And there's tons of content being created with the help of AI in some cases. And then it just goes out there, right, on job postings and so on. But nobody's really tracking, like, how is it engaging with the audience? Is it resulting in high quality applicants? Is it resulting in engagement from your employees? Right? Nobody's really asking that, right? Because all these dollars are being spent. We just talked about how tight the budgets are. There's a lot of money, we believe, at Cliquify is being wasted just on content that gets pushed out there without really understanding what it's doing for you.
Yeah, I think you touched on the second part of that kind of coin, let's call it. If one is data-driven decision-making influence, the other one is proving your outcomes, right? So how can you then prove outcomes to associate dollars invested with actual return on investment? Not just because employees are more engaged, right? But because it's actually more engaged employees, better leaders in the business means better customer experiences, means more money for you. Kind of changes I mean, maybe this is silly to say, but it kind of changes your chief people officer to like your chief profit officer. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you look at them a little bit differently when you realize all of your business is coming from the people that power it. So yeah.
Yeah, and there's so many ways to look at that, right? Like for example, within the Cliquify context, we've got frontline, like there's so much focus on frontline talent as it should be, right? Because they're the ones who actually are the feet on the street actually making money for our company, I think, right? Aside from, of course, sales and more professional ranks. But really, if you look at frontline talent, regardless of the industry, we've got one scenario where a colleague is sharing a story about how another colleague, covered their night shift for them, right? Something as simple as that is so powerful for companies to understand, and frankly, they're using Cliquify to thank that colleague, right? And they're posting it on Instagram and Facebook and so on. So this is real, like how people are engaging in a scalable way. Frankly, in this instance, there's no HR involved, right? HR is just an enabler in this instance, right?
Yeah, yeah, really important. It's the evolution of how the story is being told, right? It started with the company will just tell the story to you, and they'll let you know how you should feel and how great they are, and where you should apply. And then it was the recruiters will help tell that story to you once they find you and decide that you would be a good fit. And now it's really, all of the stories that people are addicted to on Instagram and all the real life moments that the more content that you have and the diversity of that content is sure to land with somebody who is that hidden gem that you're looking for. But it's that diversity of content. And it's saying that, again, it speaks to, it's not a one size fits all company. You're not looking just for one type of person. You're looking for this beautiful quilt of talent. So I love it. I love the authenticity of content. I love that it's not as polished and as fancy as it used to be when we would have budgets. And I remember my first budget as an employer brand leader. It sounded like a big number, and I was like, man, it's got a lot of money. And then I realized 85% of it was for tchotchkes and banners on campuses across the country. I was like, oh, okay. Well, I guess that leaves me with very little to do anything else with. And just the evolution of, and then again, the rest of it would be spent on these beautiful videos that we would put on our website about what a great place this is to work. And, and have these wonderful landscape shots of somebody who's drinking their coffee and looking out on the porch. And, and so now it's, just the ability that you have to kind of create just a more realistic human experience for a potential candidate before they even look at an application is I think important. So I want to wrap up with a quick put you on the spot question. We are going to launch this podcast when we are launching the report. So we will have links below to the report. We'll have a link to the Top Employers Institute website, to Cliquify's website. So really excited for everybody to download that. It will be on our websites. It'll also be in the links below, and excited to kind of get some feedback on the findings there. I'm going to ask one quick rapid fire question to each of you. So Amit, what was one of the key takeaways from this year's report that really resonated with you?
I will say, and I mentioned this before, I think for me it was, of course, can I say two things? Is that okay?
I know, that's why I said one, but that's okay.
Okay.
One and a half, two. Okay.
Okay, one and a half. Well, one, I just love some of the stats that are very financial focused from TEI. So thank you, Jake, for the partnership on that. The second bit, which I was very pleased to see, is the tighter integration with workforce planning and talent management functions. So, Sandra, based on your experience, as you know, historically and even presently, employer branding is so focused on talent attraction campaigns, like very externally focused. And it's good to see that the employer branding function is now getting tighter with workforce planning initiatives, with talent management, kind of be more internally focused as well. Because that's your best talent, right? You already invested so much money in developing the skills and the capabilities internally. And how do you capitalize on that is huge. So for me, that was the biggest takeaway.
Great. Jake, over to you.
Nice. Yeah, I'd say the one takeaway that I have from the report, I think it's not to, kind of steal words that were mentioned earlier, but I think for me it's how interconnected these things are for your, not only building your employer brand, but actually being a top employer, right? A lot of companies want to say they're a top employer, want to, promote that they are, but many aren't actually top employers. If you can actually be a top employer, not only by going through our certification program, but also by connecting the people practices you have with the brand you're sharing and keeping it consistent. I just think for me, in this report, I realized this stuff's super connected. I'm thinking about it, across all of HR and all of people and all of human capital, but this stuff as it relates to your employee value prop and your brand, it matters, and it's really connected not only for the individual story of what you're trying to do when you're attracting a person, but also for business outcomes. So that was exciting to me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for joining today. I'm very excited to get everybody an opportunity to take a look at this, to download the report. I'd also love to hear any feedback, any stories. We'd love to start a dialogue on this. This is one of those areas where I always find, when I can meet with somebody else who is an employer brand practitioner or someone who's dealing with a similar issue or some things, just having the dialogue of, well, how did you navigate through this? Or, what are your internal partnerships like? Do you build alliances internally to take this, or is it very isolated within your function? So I do think this is still one of those areas that's still very new. I mean, this hasn't been a profession for all that long. So I think the sharing of insights and information is so important. So I'd love to hear feedback. If anyone downloads that report and is inspired to kind of put their thoughts to pen to paper, we'd love to put your blog on the Cliquify site, and also take a look at Top Employers Institute and all of the research and the data that they have. And again, thank you both for joining us today, and everyone go and take a look and download the report.
Thank you. Thanks, Sandra. Thanks for facilitating this.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Jake.